Bus driver notices. Widow riding to the last stop, daily with her cat. Then he discovers her heartbreaking secret. The engine of the number 7 bus was a familiar heartbeat in the town of Harmony Creek. For 40 years, Howard Miller had felt its steady thrum beneath his feet, a resonant bass note accompanying the symphony of his daily life. Harmony Creek wasn't a bustling metropolis. It was the kind of small American town where seasons changed more noticeably than the storefronts on Main Street, and where lives unfolded at a pace dictated more by habit than ambition. Howard, a man whose silver hair was neatly combed and whose uniform was always pressed, was as much a fixture of the town as the old clock tower in the square or the willow trees lining the creek banks. His route was etched not just onto the laminated map clipped beside his steering wheel, but onto his very soul. He knew the precise groan the bus made cresting Elm Street Hill, the exact timing needed to catch the green light at Chestnut Avenue, and the particular way Mrs. Henderson from the corner bakery always waved, flour dusting her apron as he passed at 7:15 a.m. sharp. He'd seen kids he picked up for kindergarten grow up, go to college, and eventually put their own children on his bus. 40 years. It felt both like an eternity and the blink of an eye. His own life had been quiet, a marriage that had ended amicably decades ago. No children, just the bus, his small apartment overlooking the town square, and the comforting predictability of the schedule. The bus wasn't just his job, it was his world, the rolling stage upon which the quiet drama of Harmony Creek played out each day. Passengers came and went, faces blurring into a composite of the town itself. Some were regulars, their stops and schedules as ingrained as Howard's own. There was young Timmy, wrestling with an oversized backpack. Mrs. Gable, heading to her volunteer shift at the library. Mr. Henderson, off to the early shift at the lumber mill. And then there was Esther. Esther Dubois wasn't like the other regulars. She appeared later in the morning, usually around 10:30 a.m., always at the stop bordering Willow Creek Park. She was a small woman, bird-like in her movements, with wisps of white hair escaping a neatly pinned bun and eyes the faded blue of old denim. She always wore a well-kept, slightly old-fashioned coat, regardless of the season, varying only its weight. But the most constant thing about her, the detail that first caught Howard's sustained attention, was the cat. Nestled securely in her arms, as if it were the most precious cargo imaginable, was a fluffy ginger cat. It wasn't a kitten, but a mature animal, with thick fur the color of marmalade and strikingly intelligent blue eyes, an unusual color for a ginger cat, Howard thought. It never struggled or made a sound. It simply sat, cradled in Esther's arms, gazing out the window with an unnerving stillness, its fluffy tail occasionally giving a slow, contemplative twitch. Esther would board with a quiet nod, her fare ready, exact change, always. She'd murmur a soft, "Good morning, Mr. Howard," her voice thin but clear, and make her way to the third seat on the right, the one that offered an unobstructed view of the passing streets but wasn't directly over the bumping wheel well. She'd settle herself, adjust the cat in her lap, and then, like the animal, she would simply watch. At first, Howard hadn't paid her specific journey much mind. She was just another passenger, albeit a memorable one due to her feline companion. He assumed she was going to the senior center near the end of the line, or perhaps visiting someone in the small nursing home a block further down. But weeks turned into months, and a pattern emerged, subtle yet undeniable. Esther never disembarked at the senior center. She never got off at the nursing home stop. She never pulled the cord for any of the residential streets or the small cluster of shops near the terminus. She stayed. Every day, Monday through Friday, Esther Dubois and the silent ginger cat rode the number 7 bus until it reached the final stop, the turnaround point in a quiet, slightly neglected cul-de-sac on the town's western edge. Here, Howard would shut off the engine for his mandatory 10-minute layover. The other passengers, if any remained, would have hurried off. But Esther would linger. She'd sit there, gently stroking the cat's soft fur, her gaze still fixed on the window, though now it reflected only the overgrown hedges of the turnaround and the back fences of unfamiliar houses. Sometimes her lips moved, forming silent words Howard couldn't decipher. Only when he restarted the engine, signaling the beginning of the return journey, would she seem to gently rouse herself. She'd ride the entire route back, getting off precisely where she started, at the Willow Creek Park stop, offering another quiet nod and a soft, "Thank you, Mr. Howard," before disappearing among the trees. Howard was a man accustomed to routines, but this one puzzled him. It wasn't logical. It cost her double fare, for one thing. Where was she going? What purpose did this silent, circular journey serve? He was a reserved man by nature, not prone to prying into his passengers' lives. Decades behind the wheel had taught him the value of discretion. People used the bus for all sorts of reasons, carried all sorts of burdens, visible and invisible. It wasn't his place to ask. Yet Esther's quiet presence, her unwavering ritual, began to occupy a space in his thoughts. He found himself looking for her slight figure waiting by the park gates, feeling a small, unacknowledged sense of relief when she appeared. He noted the days she wasn't there, rare occasions, usually marked by particularly bad weather, and felt a strange absence on the bus. The ginger cat, too, became a focal point of his curiosity. Its calm demeanor was remarkable. Most cats would be yowling or frantic on a rumbling bus. This one seemed perfectly serene, almost regal, in Esther's arms. One Tuesday afternoon in late October, a persistent drizzle slicked the streets of Harmony Creek, blurring the autumn colors into watercolor smudges on the bus windows. The air inside was warm and damp, smelling faintly of wet wool and exhaust fumes. Passenger numbers were low. The dreary weather kept most people indoors. By the time Howard reached the final few stops before the turnaround, the only soul left on board was Esther, cradling her ginger cat, whose fur seemed to glow like a small ember in the gray light. The bus pulled into the turnaround cul-de-sac with a hydraulic sigh. Howard cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof and the soft, almost inaudible purr emanating from Esther's lap. Howard watched her in the large rearview mirror. She was stroking the cat, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass. Usually, he would busy himself with his logbook or check the schedule during the layover. Today, the unspoken question felt heavier, amplified by the quiet intimacy of the empty bus and the shared cocoon against the dismal weather. He cleared his throat, the sound unexpectedly loud in the stillness. "Mrs. Esther?" She turned her head slowly, her faded blue eyes meeting his in the mirror. There was no surprise in them, only a gentle inquiry. "Excuse me for asking," Howard began, his voice careful, respectful. He swiveled slightly in his seat to face her more directly. "But I've noticed, well, you ride with me almost every day, right to the end of the line here, and then back again." He hesitated, not wanting to sound intrusive. "If you don't mind my curiosity, where are you headed that you always come right to the last stop?" A faint smile touched Esther's lips, a sad, knowing little curve. It didn't quite reach her eyes, which seemed to hold a deep, far-away melancholy. She looked down at the cat, her fingers gently tracing the outline of its ear. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Howard," she said softly, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. "Nowhere in particular, that is." She paused, gathering her thoughts. I like to sit on the bus. I like to watch the streets go by." She lifted her gaze back to the window, though her reflection showed she was still aware of Howard's attention. "My husband, Arthur. He passed away 5 years ago now." Another pause, filled only by the rain. "When he was alive, this was something we did. Almost every afternoon, after lunch. We'd get on your bus, Mr. Howard, sit right here, side by side." Her hand continued its rhythmic stroking of the ginger fur. "We didn't talk much, just watched Harmony Creek unfolding outside the window. He loved looking at the houses, wondering about the people inside. Loved seeing the seasons change along the route. It was our quiet time together. Simple, I suppose, but it was ours." Howard listened, motionless. He remembered Arthur Dubois, vaguely a quiet man, often seen walking hand in hand with Esther in the park. He hadn't realized they were regular riders back then. Esther sighed, a soft, breathy sound. After he was gone, the house felt so empty. The silence was too loud." She looked down at the cat, a deeper tenderness in her expression. "So I kept doing it. Riding the bus. It feels closer to him, somehow. Seeing the same streets, sitting here. It's like continuing a conversation." She finally looked directly at Howard, a fragile honesty in her gaze. "And then there's Leo," she said, nodding towards the cat. "Arthur found him, just a few weeks before he fell ill. A stray, hiding under the porch, soaked and shivering. Arthur brought him in, cleaned him up, named him Leo because he looked like a little lion." Her smile flickered again, warmer this time. "He was the last living thing Arthur brought into our home, the last bit of warmth he shared." She cuddled the cat closer. "So now, Leo comes with me. He's good company. Aren't you, Leo?" The cat blinked slowly, pressing its head into her hand. "He sits here, just like Arthur used to, watching the world go by." Howard felt a lump form in his throat. 40 years he'd driven this route, witnessing snippets of lives, joys and sorrows through his windshield and mirrors. But this quiet revelation, delivered with such simple, unadorned sadness, struck him profoundly. He saw her now not just as the eccentric old lady with the cat, but as a woman carrying her grief and her memories along the familiar path, turning the mundane rhythm of the number 7 bus into a personal, rolling memorial. He cleared his throat again. "Arthur," he said quietly. "I remember him. A kind face. Always together, you two." Esther nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Yes," she whispered. "Always." The 10-minute layover was nearly up. The rain continued its steady drumbeat. Howard turned back towards the front, his hand hovering over the ignition key. The simple act of starting the engine felt different now, imbued with a new significance. He wasn't just starting the return journey. He was helping Esther continue hers. "Well," he said, his voice gentle, "it's a peaceful way to remember, Mrs. Esther. A peaceful way." He turned the key. The engine rumbled back to life, its familiar heartbeat filling the quiet space once more. As he pulled away from the curb, leaving the lonely turnaround behind, he glanced in the mirror. Esther was looking out the window again, Leo purring softly in her lap, 2 silent figures bathed in the gray afternoon light, journeying through a landscape of memory. The rhythm of the route felt the same, yet everything had changed. The autumn weeks bled into the starker beauty of early winter in Harmony Creek. Frost etched delicate patterns on the bus windows each morning, and the willow trees by the park stood skeletal against a pale sky. Howard's routine continued, the number 7 bus tracing its familiar path. but something had shifted within its rolling confines. His awareness of Esther Dubois and her silent companion Leo had transformed from passive observation into a quiet, protective empathy. Their morning exchange remained simple. "Good morning, Mr. Howard," met with his slightly warmer, "Morning, Mrs. Esther. Morning, Leo." He found himself instinctively checking the park stop a little more intently around 10:30 a.m., a subtle tension easing in his shoulders when he saw her slight figure waiting, the ginger cat a small beacon of color against her dark coat. He made sure the bus knelt properly for her, giving her ample time to board without feeling rushed. Small gestures, unspoken, but they formed the new architecture of their daily encounter. The conversations didn't become frequent, not immediately. Esther was naturally reserved, and Howard respected the quietude that seemed essential to her daily pilgrimage. But sometimes, during the 10-minute layover at the turnaround, the silence would invite a shared word or two. One crisp November afternoon, sunlight glinting off a thin layer of frost, Esther pointed a gloved finger towards a small, slightly neglected Cape Cod-style house they passed just before the final stop. "That yellow one," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. "Arthur painted those shutters. Cornflower blue, he called the color. Said it matched my eyes." She smiled faintly. "They need a new coat now." Howard slowed the bus almost imperceptibly as they passed it on the return journey. "He did a good job," he offered. "It's a cheerful color." "He was good with his hands," Esther replied, stroking Leo. "Built the bookshelf in our living room, fixed anything that broke. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He worked at the post office for 35 years, but he loved making things right." Another time, triggered by the sight of children skating on the newly frozen town pond, she spoke of Arthur teaching her to skate decades ago on that very pond. "I was clumsy," she chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "He spent more time picking me up than skating himself, but he never complained, just held my hand tighter." Howard learned about Arthur Dubois in these fragmented glimpses, a man who loved gardening, who whistled off-key while washing dishes, who had a knack for finding four-leaf clovers, who read history books aloud to Esther in the evenings. He learned about their life together, a tapestry woven from small, ordinary moments that gained extraordinary significance in their absence. The bus route, Howard realized, wasn't just a general reminder of their shared habit. Specific landmarks along the way were triggers, unlocking doors to rooms in Esther's memory palace. The bakery where Arthur always bought her a cream horn on Saturdays, the library where they borrowed stacks of books, the park bench under the big oak where he'd proposed the number 7 past them all. Leo remained Esther's steadfast, silent shadow. Howard, feeling bolder in their established quiet understanding, started keeping a small bag of catnip-flavored treats in his compartment. One afternoon during the layover, he held one out tentatively. "Would Leo care for a little something, Mrs. Esther?" Esther looked surprised, then pleased. "Why, that's very thoughtful, Mr. Howard. He does enjoy a treat." She took it gently and offered it to the cat, who sniffed it delicately before crunching it with quiet satisfaction. A low purr rumbled from the ginger fur. "He says thank you," Esther smiled. After that, the offering of a treat became a small ritual within the larger one, a moment of connection that included the furry embodiment of Esther's past. Howard found these interactions subtly changing him too. Driving the same route for 40 years could easily become monotonous, the scenery fading into wallpaper, the passengers mere fares. But Esther's story, her quiet dedication to memory, had resensitized him. He started noticing more the way young Timmy always looked out for his little sister at the stop, the worried lines on Mr. Henderson's face that hadn't been there last month, the shared laughter between two teenagers in the back seat. He found himself greeting people with a bit more warmth, seeing not just passengers, but individuals carrying their own invisible loads, their own private memories triggered by the passing landscape. Esther's quiet grief had somehow made his own solitary life feel less empty, connected as it now was by this thread of shared humanity. He started bringing a thermos of hot coffee on colder days, occasionally offering a cup to Esther during the layover, which she always accepted with quiet gratitude. They'd sip in companionable silence, watching their breath plume in the frigid air inside the momentarily still bus. Winter tightened its grip on Harmony Creek. Snow fell, blanketing the town in white and muffling the usual sounds. The bus schedule was occasionally disrupted, roads sometimes becoming treacherous. It was during one such snowy week that a minor complication arose. The town council, citing budget cuts and low ridership on the Western Loop, proposed altering the number 7 route. The plan involved cutting off the last 3 stops, including the turnaround cul-de-sac, and rerouting the bus back towards town earlier. The change was due to be discussed at the next council meeting. Howard heard about it through the depot grapevine. His first thought was of Esther. The turnaround wasn't just a terminus. It was her destination, the anchor point of her ritual. He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He didn't know how she would react, or what the loss of that final, quiet 10 minutes would mean to her. He debated how, or even if, he should mention it. It wasn't definite yet, but knowing Esther's reliance on the established routine springing it on her suddenly felt wrong. He decided to broach the subject gently. The next day, the snow had stopped, but the air was biting cold. Esther boarded, Leo bundled snugly in her arms, her cheeks pink from the chill. When they reached the turnaround, the snow-covered hedges creating a sense of deep isolation, Howard offered her the usual treat for Leo and a cup from his thermos. "Mrs. Esther," he began carefully, stirring his own coffee. "There's some talk down at the depot about maybe changing the route slightly." Esther looked at him, her blue eyes steady over the rim of her paper cup. "Changing how?" "Well," Howard shifted awkwardly. "They're talking about maybe cutting off these last few stops, making the turnaround earlier, back near Maple Avenue." He avoided her gaze, looking out at the pristine snow. "Low ridership, they say. Budget reasons." He risked a glance back at her. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he saw a flicker of something behind her eyes: dismay, perhaps fear. Her hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Leo's fur. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "Maple Avenue," she repeated softly. It wasn't the same. It wasn't the quiet cul-de-sac, the end point Arthur had known. It wasn't the place where the world outside seemed to fall away, leaving just her, the cat, and her memories. "It's just talk for now," Howard added quickly. "There's a council meeting next week. Nothing's decided." Esther nodded slowly, her gaze distant again. "Things change," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Arthur always said, the only constant thing is change." She looked down at Leo, burying her face briefly in his soft fur. But some changes are harder than others. The engine needed starting. The return journey beckoned. As Howard pulled away, he felt a weight settle upon him. He had known this woman for only a matter of months, their connection woven from shared silence and brief exchanges on a public bus. Yet the thought of her quiet ritual being disrupted, her fragile link to the past potentially severed by a line item in the town budget, filled him with a surprising ache. He glanced in the mirror. Esther sat straight, her back not quite touching the seat, staring out the window with fierce intensity, as if trying to memorize every detail of the route, just in case it was one of the last times she would see it this way. The steady rhythm of the bus felt less comforting today, underscored by a new, unwelcome note of uncertainty. The week leading up to the town council meeting was heavy with unspoken tension. Every time Esther boarded the bus, Leo nestled in her arms. Howard felt a pang of anxiety. She was quieter than usual, her gaze fixed even more intently on the passing landmarks, as if committing them to memory against a potential future where they would slide past unseen from her usual seat. She rarely initiated conversation during the layovers. Even the simple exchanges about the weather seemed to require effort. She spent the time stroking Leo, her fingers moving rhythmically through his ginger fur, her lips sometimes moving silently. Howard continued his small rituals, the careful boarding, the treat for Leo, the offered cup of coffee, but they felt fragile now, overshadowed by the impending decision. Howard found himself unusually agitated. He considered attending the council meeting, perhaps saying a few words about the importance of the full route to some residents, though he knew his voice, the voice of a bus driver, likely carried little weight against budget lines and efficiency reports. He mentioned his concerns to his shift supervisor, a gruff but fair man named Sal. Sal listened, nodding sympathetically, but shrugged. "It's numbers, Howie," he'd said, clapping Howard on the shoulder. "Town's got to save where it can. That western loop's always been dead weight after Maple Ave, you know it." Howard knew Sal was right, logically. But logic felt cold against the image of Esther's face when he'd told her about the possible change. The day after the meeting, Howard arrived at the depot to find the new schedules posted. The number 7 route had been officially shortened. Effective the following Monday, the last stop would be Maple Avenue, just before the road curved towards the old cul-de-sac. The turnaround point, Esther's quiet sanctuary, was gone from the map. He drove his route that day with a leaden feeling in his stomach. When Esther boarded at the park stop, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Esther," he mumbled. She nodded, her face pale, and made her way to her usual seat. He knew she must have heard. News traveled fast in Harmony Creek. When they reached the new final stop at Maple Avenue, a busy intersection compared to the old turnaround, Howard pulled over. Other passengers disembarked quickly. Esther remained seated. Howard waited, engine idling, the sounds of traffic filtering in. This wasn't a layover point anymore. He was meant to continue the loop back towards town after a brief pause. After a minute, he cleared his throat gently. "Maple Avenue, Mrs. Esther. End of the line now." She looked up, her eyes swimming with a confusion that pierced Howard's heart. "Oh," she said softly. "Right. Of course." She gathered Leo, her movements stiff. "Things change." She stood up, steadied herself, and walked to the front. "Thank you, Mr. Howard." Her voice was barely a whisper. She stepped off the bus onto the busy sidewalk, looking small and lost amidst the afternoon shoppers and the noise. Howard watched her stand there for a moment, clutching Leo, looking down the road towards the missing final stops, before she turned and began walking slowly back in the direction they had come, presumably towards the park stop miles away. The next day, Esther wasn't at the park stop, nor the day after. A week went by, then 2. The familiar rhythm of Howard's day felt jarringly incomplete. Her absence left a void in the third seat on the right, a silent reproach to the new, truncated route. He found himself saving Leo's treats, then finally put the bag away in his locker, a lump in his throat. He missed her quiet presence, their brief exchanges, even the shared silence. He worried about her. Was she managing okay? Was she finding another way to hold on to her memories? He thought about stopping by her house. He knew roughly where she lived, a small cottage near the park, but it felt like an intrusion. Their connection was defined by the bus, by the route. Stepping outside those boundaries felt complicated. Then, one wind-swept afternoon in early spring, just as the first crocuses were tentatively pushing through the cold earth, he saw her. Not at the park stop, but walking slowly along Chestnut Avenue, leaning heavily on a cane he'd never seen her use before. She looked thinner, frailer. Leo wasn't with her. Howard felt a surge of concern strong enough to override his usual reserve. He was running slightly ahead of schedule. He pulled the bus over to the curb a little way ahead of her, activated the hazard lights, and opened the door as she approached. "Mrs. Esther?" he called out gently. She looked up, startled. Recognition dawned slowly in her eyes, followed by a flicker of her old, sad smile. "Mr. Howard," she breathed, sounding breathless. "Are you all right?" he asked, his brow furrowed with worry. "Can I give you a lift somewhere?" She shook her head, leaning on her cane. Just out for some air," she said. "It's been a while. Had a bit of a fall a few weeks back. Nothing broken, thank goodness, but it shook me up. Doctor said to take it easy." She glanced down the street, avoiding his eyes. "Leo. He's been staying close to home with me. Gets anxious when I'm unsteady." So that was it. The stress of the route change, the disruption to her routine, perhaps combined with the icy patches of late winter, had led to a fall. Her forced confinement and the loss of her daily ritual had clearly taken a toll. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Howard said sincerely. "I'd been wondering, well, I missed seeing you and Leo on the bus." A shadow crossed her face. "The bus," she trailed off. "It's not the same, is it? Ending there, at Maple. It feels unfinished." She sighed. "Tried it once, the week after the change. Leo didn't like it either. Too noisy, too rushed. Didn't feel like remembering Arthur there." Impulsively, Howard made a decision. "Look, Mrs. Esther," he said, keeping his voice low. "My shift ends in about an hour. I have to take the bus back to the depot, which isn't far from the old turnaround. If you're feeling up to it, maybe I could swing by your place, pick you and Leo up, and we could just sit there for a few minutes. Off the clock, just for old time's sake." Esther stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Tears welled in her faded blue eyes. "Oh, Mr. Howard," she whispered. "Would you really? That's extraordinarily kind." "It's no trouble," Howard insisted, feeling a warmth spread through his chest despite the spring chill. "Gets lonely, just driving an empty bus back to the depot anyway." They arranged it quickly. An hour later, Howard finished his route, logged out, and drove the empty bus the few blocks to Esther's cottage. She was waiting by the gate, wearing her coat. Leo nestled securely in her arms, her cane hooked over her wrist. She boarded carefully, her face alight with a fragile hope Howard hadn't seen before. He drove the familiar streets, past Maple Avenue, and continued towards the quiet cul-de-sac. It felt strangely illicit, driving the bus there off-route, off-schedule, but also deeply right. He pulled into the turnaround, the exact spot where they used to have their layovers, and cut the engine. Silence descended, deeper and more profound than Howard remembered. The overgrown hedges, the back fences, the quiet houses, it was all exactly the same. Esther closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing deeply. Leo began to purr, a resonant rumble in the stillness. "Thank you," Esther murmured, opening her eyes. They were clear, filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Howard." She had never called him by his first name before. He simply nodded, looking out his own window, giving her the space she needed. They sat there for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Esther didn't say much, just stroked Leo and gazed out the window, but her posture seemed less burdened, her breathing easier. It was as if a vital piece of her world had been briefly, carefully restored. When it was time to go, she thanked him again, her voice thick with emotion. As he helped her down the steps, she paused, resting a frail hand on his arm. "You understand," she said softly, "what this means." Howard looked into her tired, grateful eyes, and for the first time, reflecting on his own quiet life, his 40 years watching the town roll by, his own small, ingrained habits, he thought perhaps he finally did. The fractured rhythm had been momentarily mended, but the fragility of the thread connecting Esther to her past, and now, unexpectedly, to him, felt more apparent than ever. Howard's clandestine trips to the old turnaround spot became a quiet covenant between him and Esther. They didn't happen every day. Sometimes his shifts didn't line up, other times Esther wasn't feeling strong enough, but perhaps once or twice a week, after his official duties were done, the number 7 bus would make its unscheduled detour. He'd pull up to her cottage, she'd be waiting with Leo, and they'd make the short journey to the cul-de-sac, reclaiming those stolen 10 minutes of peace. No one seemed to notice or question the extra mileage on the bus log. Perhaps Sal, his supervisor, suspected, but if he did, he turned a blind eye, maybe understanding more than Howard gave him credit for. These brief excursions were islands of stillness in Howard's predictable routine, moments imbued with a quiet significance that resonated long after he'd driven the empty bus back to the echoing depot. Spring warmed into a gentle summer. Roses bloomed untidily in Esther's small front garden. During their trips, she sometimes spoke more about Arthur, not just the memories triggered by the route, but deeper reflections. She talked about their shared dreams, the trips they never took, the quiet satisfaction they found in their simple life in Harmony Creek. She spoke of her fears about forgetting the small details, the texture of his favorite sweater, the exact cadence of his laughter. Leo would sit patiently through these conversations, a warm, furry anchor in her lap, occasionally looking up at Howard with those unnervingly wise blue eyes. Howard, in turn, found himself sharing small pieces of his own life anecdotes about quirky passengers, his childhood memories of Harmony Creek, which often overlapped with hers, his quiet evenings spent reading or listening to old jazz records. He never spoke of deep loneliness or regrets, but the act of sharing these mundane details felt like an opening, a hesitant reciprocation of the trust Esther placed in him. He realized he looked forward to these stolen moments, not just for Esther's sake, but for his own. They punctured the comfortable solitude he had built around himself for decades. As summer mellowed into autumn again, the leaves turning fiery shades along the route Howard still drove daily, he noticed Esther was becoming increasingly frail. Her steps were slower, her breathing sometimes shallow. The cane was a constant companion now. Leo, too, seemed to move with less vigor, his ginger fur perhaps a shade duller, his naps longer and deeper. They were growing old together, woman and cat, tethered to a shared past. One crisp October afternoon during their quiet time at the turnaround, Esther turned to Howard, her gaze clear and direct. "Howard," she began, her voice thin but steady, "there's something I need to ask you." Howard waited, a sense of unease prickling him. "When my time comes," she continued, looking down at Leo, "I worry about him." She stroked the cat's head gently. "He's family, the last piece of Arthur I have left. I don't have anyone else, not really. No children, and my cousins live far away. They wouldn't understand about a cat." She looked back at Howard, her eyes pleading. "He's a good cat, Howard. Quiet, no trouble. He just needs a warm lap and a bit of kindness. Would you consider taking him, if something happens to me?" Howard was taken aback. He'd never owned a pet, never considered it. His small apartment, his long hours, it didn't seem practical. Yet, looking at Esther's anxious face, at the trusting blue eyes of the cat who had become such a familiar part of his recent life, he couldn't refuse. Leo felt like part of their arrangement now, a silent participant in their shared ritual. "Yes, Mrs. Esther," he said quietly, the name feeling more formal again in the gravity of the moment. "I would. I'll look after him. You don't have to worry about Leo." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they seemed tears of relief. "Thank you, Howard," she whispered, resting her frail hand on his arm again. "That takes such a weight off my mind. Arthur would be grateful." After that conversation, a subtle shift occurred. Esther seemed more at peace, though physically weaker. She spoke less of the past and more about the present moment, the color of the autumn leaves outside the bus window, the taste of the coffee Howard brought, the soft weight of Leo in her lap. It was as if, having secured Leo's future, she could allow herself to gently let go. A few weeks later, in early November, Howard arrived at her cottage at the agreed-upon time. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air held the sharp bite of impending winter. Esther wasn't waiting by the gate. Howard frowned, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He waited a few minutes, then shut off the engine and walked to her front door. He knocked gently. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He peered through the small window beside the door. He could see into the living room. It looked tidy, quiet. And then he saw him, Leo, sitting perfectly still on the back of the worn armchair, staring intently at a closed door down the short hallway, presumably Esther's bedroom. The cat didn't turn at the sound of the knocking. He just stared at the door. A cold dread washed over Howard. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that Esther was gone. He called 911, his voice trembling slightly as he explained the situation to the dispatcher, the elderly woman living alone, the missed arrangement, the cat waiting. He waited on the porch steps, the familiar rumble of his bus engine now silent behind him. He watched Leo through the window, a small ginger sentinel keeping vigil. Eventually, paramedics arrived, then a police car. They went inside, and after what felt like an eternity, a kind-faced officer came out. "She passed away peacefully in her sleep, looks like," the officer said gently. "Neighbor found the note on the back door this morning asking for someone to call us if she didn't come out by noon, but the neighbor was out until just now. Looks like you got here before anyone else realized." He paused. "You a relative?" "No," Howard said, his voice thick. "Just her bus driver. We were friends." "She mentioned a friend, the bus driver, in her note," the officer nodded. "Asked us to contact you about her cat." And so, Howard found himself leaving Esther's quiet cottage not alone, but with a fluffy ginger cat cradled uncertainly in his arms. Leo was subdued, pressing close to Howard's chest, perhaps sensing the shift, the finality. Howard drove the bus back to the depot. The cat curled silently on the passenger seat beside him, his blue eyes watching the familiar streets pass by one last time from that vantage point. Life settled into a new rhythm. Howard's apartment, usually echoing with silence, now held the soft padding of paws, the occasional gentle meow, the comforting weight of a sleeping cat on the foot of his bed. Taking care of Leo felt like fulfilling a sacred promise, a continuation of his connection to Esther, and through her, to the quiet man named Arthur she had loved so dearly. Sometimes, on his days off, Howard found himself driving his own car out to the old turnaround spot. He'd park, cut the engine, and just sit there for a few minutes, watching the overgrown hedges and the quiet houses. He wasn't trying to replicate the ritual precisely. It wouldn't be the same without Esther, without the familiar rumble of the number 7. But it felt like paying respects, acknowledging the quiet corner of Harmony Creek that had become unexpectedly significant. Occasionally, he'd bring Leo with him. The cat would sit on the passenger seat, gazing out the window with that same contemplative stillness Howard remembered from the bus. He wondered what the cat remembered, what he understood. Did he miss Esther? Did he associate this place with her quiet presence, her gentle stroking? Driving his route, Howard still saw the landmarks that had triggered Esther's memories: the yellow house with the faded blue shutters, the park bench, the library. They sparked memories for him now, too. Memories of a frail woman and her ginger cat, of quiet conversations, of shared silence, of a promise kept. He still greeted his passengers, perhaps with even more kindness now, more awareness of the invisible stories they carried with them onto his bus. 40 years driving the same streets. It had seemed like such a simple life. But Esther Dubois, with her quiet grief and her faithful cat, had shown him the profound depth that could exist within the mundane, the enduring power of memory, and the unexpected ways connection could bloom in the most ordinary of places. As the bus rumbled along its familiar path, Howard Miller, the veteran driver, carried his own memories now, punctuated by the quiet presence of a ginger cat with wise blue eyes waiting for him back home. The rhythm of his route continued, but it played a different, deeper, more resonant tune.